My investigation team has seen, in all our years of service, such a level of violence against a defenseless person.
Yeah, some cases are truly horrifying. Not because of the complex story or the killer's creepy, disgusting face, but because they make you realize it could happen to you. These are Kiyran Earnshaw and Luke Gaukroger. At the time of the murder, Kiyran had just turned 18 and Luke was 15 years old. And yet, they took great pleasure in nearly decapitating an innocent man. Then, Luke wrote a rap song about it, proudly announcing his lack of remorse. In fact, both boys would do it again if they were free right now. How can two teenagers think like this? What has to go wrong for them to commit a frenzied murder with a samurai sword? And what went wrong that night for poor Robert Wilson to lose his life in such a horrific way? We'll explore these questions and many more in today's video. But before we go on, I must warn you, this video contains very graphic descriptions of a violent murder. If this is not something you can handle, this is your chance to turn back. Today's case takes us to West Yorkshire in the UK. Although it's called West Yorkshire, it's a region located pretty much in the middle of the country, known for Guy Fawkes, the UK's biggest maze, and amazing Yorkshire tea, of course. Sadly, West Yorkshire has become known for a growing crime rate over the last decade. With a growth of 5% per year, West Yorkshire has become the third unsafest metropolitan county in England. One of the towns in West Yorkshire is Huddersfield, and this is where today's case takes place. Huddersfield was an industrial powerhouse of the Victorian era, and this left it with some great architecture. But today, it's not a very popular town to live in, and with the drab weather looming over your head for most of the year, you can imagine why the streets aren't filled with dancing teens. Huddersfield was the home of 53-year-old Robert Wilson. Robert was in charge of a pharmaceutical plant in Huddersfield. Everyone who knew him remembered him as extremely hardworking and always gave 110% to make sure everyone was happy. At home, he wasn't any different. Robert lived with his wife, Elaine, and his two stepchildren, Jack and Ella. Ella remembered he was hardworking, had a wicked sense of humor, and was fun to be with. He enjoyed many things in life, loved all sports, gardening, long-distance walking, especially in the Yorkshire Dales, and music, of which he was very knowledgeable. When he wasn't at work or with his family, Robert spent his time at the Dewsbury Golf Club, where he had a ton of friends and there was always a fun tournament going on. Wife, kids, a job at the factory, and weekends at the golf club might sound like the life of any average Joe, but Robert excelled through his dedication to everything he did and to his kindness. He never had an enemy, and he treated everyone he knew with warmth and respect. That's the most valuable thing at the end of the day. And this is what makes what's about to happen to him so much worse. On January 16, 2020, Elaine left Robert at the train station and kissed him goodbye as he left for work. She was certain she would see him in a few hours, but Robert would never make it back home. It was late evening and the factory staff was getting ready to close shop for the night. This was when a group of 6 drunk teens stumbled into the factory yard. They just wanted a place to throw up. They were extremely drunk, but they were also underage. Some factory workers saw them and didn't think much of it. They were a bunch of drunk teens. How much harm could they do? However, they weren't supposed to be at the plant. These were private grounds, so someone played a warning over the speakerphone. In a teenage group, there was a girl and 4 boys. When she heard the speakerphone go off, the girl urged the boys to get going. For a brief moment, everyone started walking toward the exit. This was going to be a peaceful night, except 15-year-old Luke had forgotten something. Luke claimed he lost his knife on the factory grounds and he was going to look for it. What 15-year-old carries a knife with them? As Luke and his female friend were looking for the knife, another boy was getting in an argument with the factory supervisor. 18-year-old Kiyran Earnshaw had lit a cigarette in the plant's parking lot, and Robert Wilson had come out to notify him that he couldn't do that. Kiyran said of course he could. His mom worked at the same factory and this was public parking, he claimed. By now, the girl from the group had left, but Luke had another problem. Now he claimed he'd lost his phone too. So his other friends turned on their iPhone lighters and looked through the parking for his phone. One of the staff members and Robert's friend, John, found the phone on the ground, but its screen was severely cracked. Seeing this, he decided not to pick it up, worried that Luke might blame him for cracking it. Robert eventually decided to call security to escort the group outside, but Kiyran saw him on his phone and he became paranoid that Robert was filming them. So he took out his samurai sword. Several minutes later, a local resident heard a horrible scream cutting through the dead of the night. I heard someone screaming. It was horrible. I heard high-pitched screaming, and then I saw blue lights. There was one guy on the floor and people standing over him. More and more police arrived and the helicopter came. I could see a drip being held by one of the officers as paramedics were performing CPR. After many minutes, CPR stopped. Robert had been stabbed over 100 times with a samurai sword. When the paramedics arrived at the scene, Kiyran and Luke were trying to decapitate him with the sword. The two boys tried to flee the scene, but they were arrested on site. However, Robert's life could not be saved. Even a few blows with a samurai sword could be fatal. He had not just been attacked, he'd been butchered in a frenzied murder, and no one could understand why. Imagine seeing the love of your life in this state. Robert's wife, Elaine, was called as soon as the police pronounced him dead. She was even allowed to hold his hand, and the police urged her not to hold an open casket funeral. It would be too traumatizing to see him like this. But Elaine had already seen him. She couldn't be the same anymore. She didn't sleep at all. She had severe panic attacks every day, and she went through a downward spiral where she could barely look after her kids anymore. She later commented, "Without a doubt, the hardest part of losing Robert has been the manner in which he lost his life. That he had such a horrific death has been hard to bear for us. We have tried to look for positives and are thankful that it was only one life that was taken. It could quite easily have been more." Indeed, Robert wasn't the only one attacked that night. Kiyran and Luke's trial in July 2020 would reveal the full and horrific story from that night. Perhaps the first shocking image that was shown during the trial was Kiyran's 20-inch samurai sword. Honestly, who carries a samurai sword at their waistband? This is not a defense weapon. It is a murder weapon. Kiyran was looking to do harm that night. And as it turns out, it wasn't the first time. Both Kiyran and Luke had extensive criminal records, including charges for violent crimes. In October 2016, Kiyran took a knife out at school and stabbed another student twice in the stomach. Kiyran was 14 at the time. And on January 16th, 2020, Kiyran had taken Xanax and cocaine, and he'd glugged it all down with vodka. He and his group of delinquent tweens were beyond inebriated when they trespassed on the factory grounds. During the trial, something truly heartbreaking was revealed. Robert and his factory staff tried to help the boys find Luke's phone. Not only were they not aggressive to the teens, they were kind, just like everyone remembered Robert. The teens were told politely that they couldn't be in the factory parking, and they were pointed to the exit. To think how the night continued is simply unfathomable. When the teens got rowdy and Kiyran began having an attitude, Robert called security. But before he could make the call, Kiyran accused him of filming them, and then he took out his samurai sword. He attacked Robert once, then his friend John jumped to his aid. That's when Kiyran attacked John as well, almost cutting his left hand off. Panicking, John and the other factory worker on site, Miss Thulis, ran away to call for help. This was a mere minute into the attack, but it was already too late. As John was calling the police, he saw Kiyran grab Robert by the coat and pull him around the parking. Robert managed to escape Kieran's grip and started running away, but a few seconds later, he collapsed on his front. He'd already been stabbed and he was too weak to run. Kiyran is a real-life monster. Seeing how Robert collapsed, he didn't feel remorse or even try to flee the scene. Instead, he went over, mocking him for collapsing. He then stomped on his head 6 times before lifting his sword and stabbed him in the chest at full force. That's when Luke joined the scene and started shouting at Kiyran. Was he shouting at him to stop? No, he was repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Pass me the shank." Yeah, Luke just wanted to be part of the action. But Kiyran ignored him at first. He was too caught up in the murder. He stabbed Robert another 4 times as hard as he could. Finally, Luke grabbed the sword from Kiyran and attacked Robert another 11 times in the back and in the head. When he was practically exhausted, he passed the sword from Kiyran, who wasn't done with Robert. He started chopping up his body. Kiyran then dropped the sword and almost left the scene. But he remembered what he wanted, to rob Robert too. He and Luke went through his pockets and then they took his coat off. Then Kiyran started chopping Robert's body some more before passing on the sword to Luke, who stabbed him 10 more times. 10 minutes into the attack, the boys decided to cut Robert's head off. When they realized this was harder than they thought it would be, they started reverting to stabbing stabbing him. All the while they were fighting over control of the sword, with Luke shouting, "Pass me the shank," over and over again. In the final minutes, Luke shouted, "Get his head. I want to cut his head. Kai, I want to cut his head." But Kiyran would be the one to decapitate Robert. However, as Kiyran was struggling to do so and Luke was struggling to grab his sword, the police arrived. That's when the boys attempted to run away, and they were arrested together with their 3 other friends. Heartbreakingly, in the court, CCTV of the brutal murder was shown, and a recording of Robert's last words played as well. The audio recording started with Kiyran shouting, "Come here," and accusing Robert of filming them. Robert replied, "No one's filming you," to which Kiyran said, "Video and man, and shit, yeah?" They both repeated what they wanted to say several times. Robert insisted Kiyran wasn't being filmed, and Kiyran insisted with his insults. He simply wasn't listening to what Robert was saying. He had already made up his mind. He was going to kill Robert. Robert then calls for John repeatedly and calls Kiyran a bastard over and over again. But his calls and pleas for help get shorter and weaker and are replaced by horrific screams. Robert died in agony. His cries got louder, more high-pitched, more desperate, then they got weaker too. He couldn't fight the boys off anymore. His last words were, "I'll let you go, boys." Robert died a kind, helping man who didn't want any conflicts. After the trial was over, Elaine looked at the killers and told them, "I want you to know you have taken the life of a much respected, admired, and good man." Kiyran was in such a frenzied state when the police arrested him, he had to be tasered twice to be subdued. He was extremely drunk and high and was slurring his words. He kept asking the officers why he was being arrested. Yeah, he just a man with a samurai sword, and he was wondering why he was being detained. He even complained of police harassment as he was being taken to the station. Inside the police car, he banged his head on the cage repeatedly, and by the time he arrived at the station, he was snoring in a deep sleep. When an officer woke him up, they asked him what he'd taken, and he simply replied, and Xanax. At the station, Kiyran was searched. That's when the police found he'd taken Luke's knife too. The small knife Luke was looking for that night, and perhaps the only reason why the teenage group didn't leave the factory parking in the first place. Kiyran was looking for a fight that night. During the boys' trial, the autopsy report was read aloud. Robert Wilson had suffered 100 severe wounds to his head, neck, and torso. His skull was fractured, his jugular vein was cut, and so were his liver, lungs, aorta, spleen, and bowels. He only had 1 defensive wound on his left thumb. This meant he had been rendered completely defenseless after the first attack, before his friend John even stepped in. Perhaps John was right to run for his life and call the emergency services. Imagine being Robert's family and hearing all this. Sometimes such horrific details can even make the defendants cry. They come to terms with the reality of what they did, and finally they realize the impact it has on the victim's family. But this wasn't the case with Luke. Here's what the police found he had written after the murder. One of his many very disturbing rap song lyrics. "Dip him, leave him drippin', now my shoes floating in a pool. Burn my kicks, burn my Calvins after, burn that fool. Get round there trying to turn man ghost. Yeah, I'm trying to turn man a ghost. How he's 18 and still girls that go to school that night. I was chillin' with Kai. We was trying to bill, but we had to kill it. Big man tried beefin', so we had to kill it. We was wetting my man up for like 10 whole minutes, cheffing him, and feds turn up, so we had to turn. Yeah, we tried to be toe, but we got nicked on the scene with a big full of cho. Pepper spray and taser twice for Kai. The po-po. Free me and the guys before we wet man up. We won't think twice." This appalling paper was seized, but Luke only responded with a clearer attitude. 2 weeks later, 7 pieces of paper were found in his cell. This time, he'd even titled the song. It was called No Remorse. Yeah, he was very clear about how he felt. "Sitting in the dock, trying to show remorse, but I don't feel. I can't even talk. Can't chat out the judge like I'm sorry, I was too effed. Didn't mean to catch a body. In all honesty, I wouldn't mean it though. Fake apology just to be at home. It wouldn't work though, cause I killed a guy with a big log of Sammy. Not a kitchen knife. My Cody sat up in Doncaster. Free my guy Kiyran, he ain't no actor. He got nicked with class ass as well. Both bagged on the scene, but we won't tell. Nah, we never will snitch on each other. To you, he's a psycho. To me, he's my brother. And trust me, it worked the other way around. If I heard he had beef, I'd put a pagan in the ground. But now I'm just sitting in the pen looking at 15. Won't see him again, or I might get hit with less, but still 10 years is a stress. If it gets dropped down to manslaughter, get with a 10. It's almost funny he raps about freeing Kiyran and their bro honor code where they never snitch on each other. It would almost be funny if he wasn't 15 years old at the time and he hadn't done what he did. The other two boys and the girl in the group were released from custody in January 2020 and no charges were brought against them. They had no part in the attack. Kiyran Earnshaw was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 22 years. Luke also received a life sentence, but as he was only 15 at the time of the attack, he gets the chance for parole after just 16 years. He could still be in his early 30s when he gets out, with a full life ahead of him. The judge told the teens, as he lay dying, you used the sword in repeated attempts to cut off his head. You ended his life, and you brought lifelong misery and grief to his wife, his two stepchildren, and his other family and friends. This frenzied and senseless attack on a man who was quite unable to defend himself went on for about 10 minutes. I have watched the recording, and it is a truly gruesome sight, made all the more ghastly by the fact that your blows and words, including your abuse of this dying man and his attempts to speak, were being recorded because he had begun a telephone call to the firm's security company. The judge made it clear this was a senseless attack started over nothing, and that the two boys were shockingly desensitized criminals at such a young age. Elaine just said, "How on earth have we come to this? And why?" Yeah, truly heartbreaking. Robert's murder was shocking to a myriad of people: his family, his friends, the poor factory staff, and the officers who dealt with the attack. Imagine arriving to the scene only to have to stop two manic teens from beheading a dead man. Speaking after the sentencing, DCI Mark Bowes of Homicide and Major Enquiry Team, senior investigating officer in the case, said,
Investigation team seen in all our years of service such a level of violence against a defenseless person.
He continued, "It's no exaggeration to say the level of violence used by these males in the attacks was absolutely barbaric. They both attacked in a manner which many of us would struggle to comprehend, and committed acts which were among the worst that I and other members of my investigation team have witnessed in our policing careers. We can't begin to imagine the appalling impact Mr. Wilson's murder has had on his family. Their courage and dignity in coping with such a traumatic event has been immense." Indeed, Robert's wife went on to write a beautiful tribute to her husband, trying hard to see the bright side that no one else was murdered that night, and remembering Robert as an amazing person rather than the victim. "It is a comfort to us to know he will not be forgotten, and that he made his mark in so many ways. He was a caring man who took the time to help out a local nursing home and chat to the residents, raising a smile on his faces. Everyone has been left devastated by his death. We are just so glad that these youths are now off our streets, as they obviously have no regard for anyone. To do what they did is incomprehensible to any normal human being, and they do not deserve a place in society." From prison, Kiyran wrote Elaine a letter, saying that night was the worst night of his life, and ending the letter with, "I'm sorry." Luke, well, he wrote another rap tune. "Now I'm sitting in jail, forgetting about all you. Next on the road, all of you think you're bad, but you ain't bad on your own. Step up into my zone. I'll show you that I'm on smoke. I'll be dishing out multiple pokes. You won't like me when I'm mad, like Hulk, bro. I'll show you my maximum smoke blade. Went in and out, made him pupils dilate like he's on coke. Last sound he made is a croak. I heard him struggling for his last breath when he gave up. Said, wagworn to death. I was still up the guy's chest, laughing cause my knife worked the best. Sammy made the Don hit the deck. No cap man was chopping at his neck. Us man almost detached his head. Can only imagine how much he bleed over. 100 wounds up his body. That's what Fed told me and my Donnie. OML, I'm spitting the truth. I don't tell no lies in the booth." It's hard to imagine what Luke must have endured as a child to become a proud, manic, sociopathic killer by the age of 15. As people read and were shocked by this incident, many people spoke out against the rising cases of violent knife crimes in the UK. In a sad and ironic twist, just days before the attack, the police had gathered evidence that knife crime rates were at their worst since 2009. In January 2020, the police announced over 22,000 knife offenses in England and Wales in 2019. The same year, London's murder rate skyrocketed to 149, the highest that decade.
James Basco Smith is one of a handful of people in London who has survived a deadly pattern of knife injury.
Every year, teenagers get caught between gang wars, collateral damage, to turf disputes, and revenge killings. Other innocent people simply come to the wrong place at the wrong time, much like Robert. Kiyran and Luke weren't part of any gangs. They were just two drunk, high teens with a history of violent crimes and no supporting adults around them. Many teens are in their position.
People know they are struggling, and yet nothing is done until there is a terrible tragedy.
It's sad to think that there were so many red flags with the two boys, yet no one did anything about it until it was much too late. Robert is one of the many victims of teens that are groomed from a very young age into ruthless, violent criminals. As always, thanks a lot for watching. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you know of other similar cases? Let me know in the comment section, and before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell button. See you next time.